You can start now. Arjun?
Yeah. So, warm welcome to all of you. I hope you can hear me and that I am audible. Just by way of introduction, I am Arjun Krishnan. I'm a partner at Samvad Partners, primarily handling dispute resolution from the Delhi office. I have with me Pinaz Mehta, a counsel who's based out of our Bangalore office. Today's presentation or webinar is on the recent amendments to the Arbitration and Conciliation Act 1996. And we already have some questions that have come in from the participants. And I'd like to thank all of those who are attending and participating in this webinar. These webinars have become a regular feature in Samvad. Thank you for your participation. I think we'll start with we have a short presentation about 10 slides, and we'll try to keep it as light as possible. So we'll start with some of the major amendments that have happened in 2019, the Arbitration Act, and discuss those. Right. The first major amendment is with respect to Section 11 of the Arbitration and Conciliation Act. Thank you. So Section 11 deals with the appointment of arbitrators primarily. This is yet to take effect, rather the amendments are yet to take effect. So we still have to see how they will actually play out. Simple amendment that has been that the power of appointment was earlier vested in the high courts for non-international commercial arbitration and in the Supreme Court for international commercial arbitration. Has now been vested with certain designated institutions. Now, these institutions are to be graded by the Arbitration Council of India. And I think Pinaz will be talking about this a little bit more a little later on during our webinar. So I think this is a major change, and it stems from the Sri Krishna Committee report, which came out in I think 2017. The entire purpose was to sort of rejig or relook at the workings after the 2015 amendments, which were received positively by the entire arbitration community. So the major step which has come, and this really, in a sense, marks a move which has obviously got the backing of government to shift Indian arbitrations from ad hocism to institutions, because it is generally and widely perceived, and there's a lot of, I think, documentation backing this up also, that institutions generally have certain advantages over ad hoc arbitration. Better arbitrators, better procedural control, better control over timeline and expenses of the arbitration itself. Now, these questions actually, these amendments actually raise many more questions than than uh, than I think they provide solutions in a sense, and a lot of these are quite controversial, as it were. Now, what are these institutions going to be, and how are they going to be graded by the new Arbitration Council of India? Does the manner and method of grading effectively exclude many well-established institutions? Who will appoint the arbitrators till the designation of institutions is made? Now, the proviso to Section 11(3)(a) provides that the High Courts and Supreme Courts will maintain a panel of arbitrators who will effectively act as an appointing authority till the system of designation leading comes into place from the Arbitration Council of India. So these are some of the things I think that, and some of the big questions that are unanswered by the amendments. We are all waiting to see how it will play. Now, another important sort of that has come in 11, in section 11 is the omission of 11.6a. Now, 11.6a was a provision which was introduced by the 2015 amendments to the Arbitration Act. And this was essentially introduced to overcome a judgment of the Supreme Court or a series of judgments of the Supreme Court, starting from a 7-judge bench judgment in SBP and Co. and a couple of other judgments like Bogara Qualifier. Now, the law prior to 2015 essentially was that the court, which was appointing arbitrators, would look into the existence and validity of the arbitration agreement firstly, and also a number of subsidiary issues, whether the claim, for example, was barred or stale claim, was it a time barred claim, was it barred by law, was the claim the subject of accord and satisfaction, what we usually call in a number of construction matters as covered by a no claim certificate. So these are interesting. So in order to overcome the delay, as it were, in appointing arbitrators, the scope of the inquiry for a court after the 2015 amendment was really restricted to whether the arbitration agreement existed or not, and so this was narrowed down to a great extent. The amendment procedure is not new or novel to India. In other countries as well, Singapore and Hong Kong notably, you do have institutions take on as default appointment authorities. So, something that we have taken from abroad. Firaz, you want to?
Yeah. So I just had a question here, Arjun. I mean, after what exactly are your thoughts on removal of Section 6A? What are the implications as per you?
So I think that the purpose behind removing 11.6a is not to set the clock back, as it were. I think the purpose is not to go back to the pre-2015 position which existed, the SBP judgment, Patel Engineering, and so on and so forth. The idea is really that now that the appointing duties have been handed over to an institution, the scope of inquiry will remain to be narrow. That is, whether the arbitration agreement exists or not. And in fact, we've already got a clarification of sorts from the Supreme Court in a judgment called Mayawati Trading, which just came out in September.
Right.
A few weeks back, where I think Justice Nariman's judgment, and he said that 11.6a omission or deletion of 11.6a is not intended to change the law to a pre-2015. Over to you now, Pinaz, for the next section.
Thank you, Arjun. Very good evening, everyone, and welcome. Thanks for joining the webinar. I will now be dealing with another important amendment which has been brought about by the 2019 Act, which is the formulation of the Arbitration Council of India. This has been added by, I'll just change the slide, sorry. So this has been added by way of Part 1A to the Act. And just before going into why this came about, I want to point out that we've not really seen this kind of a body or organization in any other internationally recognized arbitration institute, arbitration jurisdictions. And so that's why naturally this has created a lot of concerns already. Now, just to understand where it comes from, one has to refer to the Sri Krishna Committee report, which brought about a lot of these amendments. So the main reason for formulating and for this kind of an organization seems to be that there are a lot of arbitral institutions which are prevalent in India, the committee actually points out 35 institutions, which actually I have also not heard about. But the main concern seems to be that these organizations are self-regulated and unsupervised. So the main reason why such a body is required, especially in an India scenario, is to supervise these institutions, these arbitral institutions. Having said that, the ACI has already raised quite a few concerns, which we have listed out. One being restricting party autonomy, neutrality, ambiguity of the role, and how it will give rise to secondary litigation. So I'll be dealing with each of these now. The first one is how the ACI restricts party autonomy, which is the cornerstone of arbitration. So what happens is that the view is that it restricts parties' choice of appointing. So parties have to go before the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court can now only appoint, pursuant to Section 11, those designated arbitral institutions who have been accredited by the ACI. So naturally, the scope becomes restricted to only those arbitral institutions. And so another thought is that so definitely the Supreme Court under Section 11 is now not equipped with designating those arbitral institutions which have not been accredited by the ACI, naturally. So which comes to the thought that there are a lot of international institutions which are very well reputed. Just to give a few examples of the top 5, the SIAC, the ICC, the HKIAC. The question remains that suppose if these, many a times institutions may not want to get designated, may not want to get accredited. So then they may possibly be left out from being designated institutions, even under Section 11, which is one of the concerns. The second concern, which is the concern in relation to neutrality of the ACI. So for that, again, we will see what the recommendation. So as per the Section 43C of Part 1A, if one looks through that, it contains a Secretary to the Government of India, it contains a Secretary to the Government of India, Department of Expenditure, one representative from the body of Commerce and Industry, and the CEO member secretary. So one then notices that it has been highly populated by government officials, and this naturally raises a red flag on neutrality, specifically considering that government today is the largest litigator in India. So, and it also sort of gives a feeling that increased supervision of government in the process of arbitration, which is otherwise supposed to be a very neutral forum. The third concern is in relation to the role of the ACI. Though Section 43D2 lays down certain duties and functions of the ACI, which is to frame policies of grading arbitral institutions, recognize professional institutes for providing accreditation, review the grading of arbitral institutions and arbitrators. It doesn't specifically lay down what kind of process will be followed for this. So it's very unclear. The last concern which sort of crops up is in relation to, the more the regulation, the more the concern for it being challenged at a later stage. So that is another concern which we have on this, of it creating room for secondary litigation. The next important amendment flowing from the ACI and this amendment is in relation to qualifications of arbitrators. This is a new amendment which has been brought out. And again, let us understand why this came up. And I feel the intention, just one more thing that I need to put forth here is the intention behind the Arbitration Council of India and the qualification of arbitrators seems to be well founded. But the problem that we perceive is in relation to its implementation. So of course, the ACI came, the arbitration, the qualification of arbitrators seems to be stemming from the fact that India needs a good pool of arbitrators. That is definitely a need of the hour. But one must see what actually, again, take a step back and see actually what the committee had recommended in this regard. So what the committee had recommended was that the APCI, now again, at that point of time, as per the committee, it was the Arbitration Promotion Council of India, and as per the Act, it is now the Arbitration Council of India. So what the ACI, what the committee report suggested was that the Arbitration Council of India should recognize professional institutes for accreditation of arbitrators. There are many such institutes which are already functioning in various jurisdictions, such as the CR, the SIAB functioning. So these are all well-recognized institutions. Now, if one sees the functions of so this is what the committee recommended. Now, one of the functions of the Arbitration Council of India as per 43D is to review the grading of arbitral institutions and arbitrators. So this is one of the functions given to the Arbitration Council of India. So, and then one must see what section 43J states. It basically states that it leads us to the 8th schedule, which is the newly added Schedule 8, which says that the qualifications, experience, and norms for accreditation of arbitrators shall be as specified in the 8th schedule. So rather than leaving accreditation to these professional institutes, which was what was suggested by the committee, the law has now added another 8th schedule, which basically starts with a negative statement, which says that if one looks at the 8th schedule, it sort of sets down a 9-point criteria for the qualifications and experience of arbitrator. It only mostly deals with qualification and experience. So the first point that comes up and which has raised a lot of concern and speculation amongst international arbitration circles is in relation to the qualification norm of advocate, which then raises a concern whether foreign practitioners, because the advocate is an advocate within the meaning of Advocates Act 1961. So naturally, it raises a concern whether a foreign practitioner would then be qualified or under Schedule 8 for an India-seated arbitration. So this has already given rise to this concern because of this ambiguity, and in our view, therefore, it probably could act as a deterrent from foreign parties from choosing India as a seat of arbitration. Again, just to add here, none of the recognized arbitration jurisdictions have any such statutory requirements. Another thing which comes to my mind immediately is in relation to general norms applicable to arbitrator, which is also set out in the new Schedule 8, which makes a criteria, which says that the arbitrator shall be conversant with the Constitution of India. Now again, it's not clear as to what, it's a vague statement, a vague requirement. It again, in my view, opens up a lot of room for litigation at a later stage to challenge. And again, it will be seen at that stage how courts will interpret that what is conversant with Constitution of India actually entails. The yeah, so that's about it from me on the qualification. Arjun,
Yeah.
what are your thoughts on foreign arbitrators conducting arbitration in India after the inclusion of Schedule 8?
So I think Schedule 8 has possibly been the most controversial of all the amendments that have been brought in by the 2019 set. And the reason is, as you said, as you rightly pointed out, Pinaz, that it basically refers, the way the qualifications are framed, it really only refers to Indian qualified professionals, or seems to refer to Indian qualified professionals. But there are other provisions in the Act which continue to say that there can be foreign arbitrators. The principal among them is Section 11.1. Now, 11.1 states that a person of any nationality may be an arbitrator, and parties are free to agree on the appointment of arbitrators. Right. So the procedure it's up to the parties to agree and who they want. It can be a person of foreign nationality. So that should be the first pointer as far as this question is concerned. Then there's also an interesting provision, subsection 9 of subsection 11, which states that in an international commercial arbitration, which generally would mean that you have parties from different countries, or at least one party from some country other than India. The sole or the third arbitrator would be a person who's from a neutral nationality. So the Supreme Court has to appoint someone from a neutral nationality. Now, this also points to the fact that even under Section 11, all appointments need not be of only people who are designated under or sort of fall within the straitjacket of the 8th schedule. Now, how do we then read the 8th schedule? One way of thinking about this is that, and of course, it remains to be seen what the courts will say, because as Pinaz pointed out, we do feel that there's going to be a lot of secondary litigation around the qualification of arbitrators and the like. So one way of looking at it is the 8th schedule is a directory measure. Another way of looking at it is that really, if you read all the provisions together, it really only applies to court-appointed arbitrators, and that to one particular category of court-appointed arbitrators. That is to say, high court appointments, for example, which don't concern international commercial arbitration. Also, it's important that if you are drafting an arbitration clause, there is all the more incentive to actually name the institution of choice now, because that is one way of getting out of the 8th schedule, and maybe say what qualifications you would like. But what would be the impact again on named arbitrators is another sort of moot point. But in light of 11.1, I think party autonomy to that extent appears to be expressly preserved. That if you choose or you name an arbitrator, subject of course to the disqualifications that he or she may have under the 5th schedule, it's possible to still name an arbitrator. But again, as I said, if you want your arbitrator to be an international professional, then it makes sense to either say so in the arbitration clause or name the institution which is going to appoint the arbitrator.
Thank you, Arjun.
Next, thank
you. I think the third most important amendment that has been brought about by the 2019 Amendment Act is in relation to introduction of new timelines and certain amendments which have been brought about to Section 29A of the Arbitration Act. So before let's just understand the position. I'm sure most people are aware of the position that existed before the new amendments was it essentially didn't make any distinction between an international commercial arbitration and a domestic arbitration. It simply said that the award had to be passed within a period of 12 months, and the parties were given a choice, a right to extend the time period by 6 months if they agreed to that, and any period beyond the 18-month period, then the parties had to approach the court. So, so essentially it was a 12 plus 6, 18 months, and then after 18 months, parties had to approach the court. Again, let's understand before we get into what the actual amendment is, it's essential to understand where it stems from. So the Sri Krishna Committee report, let's look at the Sri Krishna Committee report and what it says here. So basically, it appears from the Sri Krishna Committee report that they had received a lot of concerns on, particularly in respect of international commercial arbitrations, that setting a timeline on an international commercial arbitration sort of intrudes on party autonomy and the right of parties to then tailor-make their arbitral process, particularly in relation to the timelines. So that's something in relation to flexibility. And second, in relation to the court interference in extending the timeline. So those are the two concerns which the Sri Krishna Committee was faced with, and which basically brought forth this new amendment. So as per this new amendment now, the awards in domestic arbitrations have to be now passed within 12 months from the date of completion of pleadings. So there has been a change, an amendment to Section 23 of the Arbitration Act as well, which deals with pleadings, which deals with filing of statement of claim and defense. So the 12-month period now, so basically now it says that the pleadings have to be under Section 23 be completed within a period of 6 months from the date of the arbitrators receiving notice of appointment. Now, again, one has to note that these timelines are, so these timelines now are not applicable to international commercial arbitration. So what do we perceive as challenges in this new regime? So while international commercial arbitrations have completely been left out now out of this timelines, a problem which I perceive is also there are certain large complex domestic arbitrations which also require certain amount of flexibility in terms of timelines. So while removing the international commercial arbitrations completely out of the realm of 29A and keeping these large domestic arbitrations is something which is a cause of concern. The second aspect which is a cause of concern is the pleadings and actually what amounts to pleading, because if one looks at Section 23, the new amendment, the new amended Section 23, it clearly says that 6 months from completion of the pleading. Sorry, just 1 second, please. It says that the statement of claim and defense under this section shall be completed within a period of 6 months. So the language is that the statement of claim and defense. Now, it doesn't really talk about what happens, obviously, when rejoinders are filed. What about counterclaims? So, that is one gray area there, according to me. Now, another concern is what I feel, and which is one sort of regressive step which has been taken by this amendment, is the timelines under Section 29A, though not for large domestic arbitrations, like I said, for certain other commercial arbitrations, whether they were international commercial arbitrations or domestic commercial arbitrations, were working quite well. And the new, so speed has always been one of the concerns which international circles have had as far as India is concerned as a jurisdiction. So actually the step of having this kind of a timeline, which was incorporated by the 2015 amendment, it was actually seen as a welcome step by many in the international circles. So so I basically feel that this entire traction that we developed by the 2015 amendment has basically been undone, at least as far as international commercial arbitrations are concerned. Whereas actually the solution, if one thinks, would be to give arbitral institutions the power to extend the timelines. That would have been a better solution. And this would also push parties towards institutional arbitration for large and complex disputes, which seems to be the entire genesis of this entire Sri Krishna Committee report. Another point which is noteworthy is, again, no other famous or no other established international arbitration jurisdiction has any of these timeline related issues statutorily. These powers are obviously vested and they function as per the arbitral institution rules and regulations. So again, going back to where the 6-month timeline on the pleadings comes, it's understandable. Like I said, it obviously stems from the fact, which all of us as arbitration practitioners know, that pleadings used to eat up a lot of the 18 months of the entire arbitration process. So naturally, they thought that putting a 6-month period could have possibly helped. But again, then the problem that arises now is that the aspect of pleadings being vague is going to give rise again to a lot of challenges, which is what we perceive. Again, another issue which is noteworthy here is that arbitration by its very nature is founded on the cornerstone of flexibility and autonomy of parties. Creating any rigid regulations surrounding the timelines or appointment of arbitrators, qualification of arbitrators are all seen and perceived to be sort of against these principles of arbitration. So this is as far as the timelines are concerned. Arjun, I leave it to you to go on to the next slide.
The next sort of, again, and this has been something which a lot of practitioners of arbitration and those people who have arbitration claims have been very interested in, and that is the applicability of the 2015 amendments and the amendment of section 87 of the 1996 Act. Now, this whole controversy has sort of started because of a particular section in the 2015 amendment. Now, the 2015 amendment, brought about certain landmark changes to the 1996 Act. Firstly, it got over to some extent at least, the problems with the grounds for challenge under Section 34. The other major issue which it dealt with was the so-called automatic stay. So once you had an award, if a Section 34 petition was filed, it led to an automatic stay or enforcement of the award. Now, this was thanks to a 2004 or an interpretation based of Section 36, based on a judgment of the Supreme Court called National Aluminium and Press Steel, and this, this was obviously something which we all as arbitration practitioners felt, I think, that was quite regressive of having an automatic stay, and it came in the way of the arbitration awards being enforced in a timely manner. So you could have awards which were delivered or in a reasonable period of time, but the enforcement of those awards would then take much longer. So the 2015 amendment expressly did away with the automatic stay provision. But what happened with Section 26 was the government, I think, tried to draw a line as to when the 2015 amendments would take effect or to what cases they would be applicable to. And possibly the section was sort of clumsily drafted. So this led what was supposed to lead to more certainty about the applicability of the amendments led to a greater degree of uncertainty. Some high courts took the view that it would the 2015 amendments would not apply to arbitrations and subsequent court proceedings if the notice of arbitration, uh, if the notice of arbitration was issued prior to the amendment date. Uh, Others took the view that it would apply even to pending court proceedings. Now, these were all sort of resolved over a period of 2 or 3 years, after a period of 2 or 3 years, by a judgment of the Supreme Court called BCCI Kochi Cricket. So it said effectively that there would be no automatic stay, even in pending Section 34 petitions, whether they were filed prior to or after the date of the 2015 amendments, which was 23rd October 2015. But obviously, the government seems to have felt that this was not the original intention. So they have tried to sort of bring uh, Section 26, as it were, or the 2015 amendments, back to what they had thought their original intention was. The problem has really arisen because of the timing of this. Now, it took uh, from 2015 to 2018 for the BCCI Kochi cricket judgment to come out to clarify what the position of law was, and particularly as far as automatic stay is concerned. And then it took the government, even more time to come out with the 2019 amendment. Uh, Although it was quite clear from the beginning that there was a lot of legal uncertainty and high courts were taking a different view. So I think the first thing that I would like to say is that you can take different views about Section 26 of the Act, but one thing is clear that the government should have acted faster if they wanted to clarify the position. Um,
I had one question here, Arjun. What will be the impact on pending applications for stay of award?
yeah.
And what about those that have been disposed of on the basis of BCCI versus court?
Thanks for the question, Pinaz. Also, I think we've had a few questions from some of our participants on this issue. So I'll just read some of them out. So one of the questions was, while the amendments to Section 11 are partly welcome, the amendments undoing the Supreme Court judgment in Kochi cricket and putting the clock back on automatic stay on awards and arbitration commenced prior to 2015 are really disastrous. So this is one of the comments that have come in. And also the question that you had asked is also being echoed by other participants as well. So I think what we have seen as far as practice is concerned is that both Bombay High Court and Delhi High Court now we've seen a few orders in which in enforcement matters where they have uh, actually disposed of pending enforcement proceedings on the basis of the newly amended Section 87 and said that there can't be any deposit of money in order to stay the award and there would be an automatic stay. Uh, but there also, I think there's one order of the Delhi High Court which leaves it open to the parties to proceed under Section 9 for securing the award, the post-award security as it's called, which now will become, I think, more fashionable than it was earlier, particularly in light of this amendment. I don't know whether you can call the Section 87 amendment disastrous per se, because it really depends on which side you are, whether you're on the receiving end of the award or whether you're holding the award. So people's perspectives generally tend to differ on that basis. But as arbitration practitioners, I think what I do feel is that it has not resolved the uncertainty, in fact, led to more uncertainty. As far as pending cases are concerned, where an appeal is filed, again, it's a very interesting question and a moot point, I think. But because of the fact that the amendment has retrospective, in that sense, or at least seems to have retrospective effect, as far as Section 87 is concerned, I would think that the appellate court, if it goes strictly by the text of Section 87, would have to stick with that. But the most important thing is, I think that the Section 87 is itself being, the validity of Section 87 is being challenged and is under challenge in the Supreme Court. And we expect actually that we'll have a decision soon on it as well. In fact, the next hearing is next week. And I think we're all looking at, to see what the Supreme Court has to say. Interestingly, that matter is also before Justice Nariman, and he was the one who actually warned against precisely this kind of a bill or an amendment in the Kochi cricket case.
Absolutely. Thank you, Arjun.
Yeah, I think there are a few other amendments now which are relatively minor, I think. The first one is the amendment to Section 45 of Part 2, which deals with which deals with foreign arbitration. So this is sort of similar to what we had in Section 8 in Part 1, but the language is slightly different. Now, the background of this amendment is that there was a judgment called Shinetsu, in which the Supreme Court said that parties had to be referred to arbitration unless it was found that the arbitration agreement is null and void, inoperative, or incapable of being performed. The Supreme Court held that in cases where the parties were going to be referred to arbitration, a prima facie finding that was of the existence of the arbitration agreement was enough. It is only when the suit or other proceedings which were instituted in the teeth of an arbitration agreement, as it were to continue. Only in that case would you have to come to a conclusive finding as far as the agreement being null and void, inoperative, or incapable of being performed. Now, the Sri Krishna Committee also wanted to bring a sort of uniformity or parity with Section 8 and Section 45, and they wanted a uniform standard to be applicable. But they didn't actually say what the text of the amendment should be. So what the government did was, it has brought in the prima facie requirement, but the effect is, even though the Sri Krishna Committee agreed to the Shinetsu judgment on the whole, the effect is virtually a reversal of Shinetsu, because now in a foreign arbitration matter, you can effectively stall the arbitration on if you can prima facie convince the court that the agreement is null and void, inoperative, or incapable of being performed. So again, we see that this will lead to a lot more confusion than was already there. Possibly it's an example of the government tinkering with something which really didn't need to be tinkered with, because there was already judicial pronouncement on it. So I think that this is, again, we'll have to wait and watch how this plays out. The next sort of important, or I should say, amendment is to Section 34(2)(a) of the Act. Now, the language that was earlier used was that the party must furnish proof that the grounds that in 34(2)(a) were found. What this led to as the use of the word proof was interpreted by some courts as having a requirement of evidence at the Section 34 stage. So this has now been sort of clarified that no, you don't have to have any kind of evidence. Although there was again already a Supreme Court judgment, or maybe two Supreme Court judgments, which said this. The other provision is other sort of change, which is very interesting, and I think we'd like to wait and see what happens. Is this thing about confidentiality? Now, Pinaz, what are your thoughts on 42A?
So 42A has been added, and it creates a sort of blanket provision in relation to confidentiality being maintained in respect of the arbitration proceedings. Now, the only sort of exception which has been statutorily carved out is in relation to where the disclosure is necessary for the purpose of implementation and enforcement of the award. Now, again, this in my mind, this gives rise to a lot of issues, because typically, whether, first of all, whether such a confidentiality provision is statutorily required is one question which arises. The second question, if at all it was there, then what is the need for such a narrow exception? Because many a times in arbitration proceedings, the uh, the proceedings and information needs to be shared with third parties, specifically in relation to quantum experts or in relation to forensic experts. So it now creates a shadow of doubt as to how this will go about or how this will pan out, which is something which we have to wait and watch. But it could have been left, confidentiality, in my view, could have been left to the, again, the autonomy of the party and the discretion of the party and the arbitral tribunal as to how much they want to keep confidential and what are the exceptions that they can carve out, they want to carve out. So those are my thoughts on the confidentiality bit.
I think we'll now take questions. But before we do, we already have a few questions that have been mailed in to us by the participants. I think I think we've covered quite a few of those in the course of the webinar, but there's, I think, one or two which need to be covered. So one of the participants has asked, uh, how can India become a hub for international arbitration with coming into effect of the recent amendments? Now, again, the idea is to promote institutional arbitrations, but there's also a lot of other baggage that has come along with the 2019 amendments, which we feel, I think, is going to be a deterrent for parties to come to India, because nobody knows uh, how it will play out and what it means to have these certain qualifications. Uh, but the other thing I would like to say is that it's getting to make India a hub, an arbitration hub. It's not just a matter of sort of tinkering with the Arbitration Act. A lot of other things also have to happen, which are really sort of larger questions. You need to have an improvement, overall improvement in terms of efficiency, in terms of speed, as far as the legal system itself is concerned. Now, because arbitration and legal practitioners so far have been common across arbitration litigation, and we are yet to see a sort of arbitration bar which is coming up. And also, it's worth noting that many of the sort of advanced, so-called advanced jurisdictions don't have this arbitration bar concept. It's just that they have much better scheduling of both court matters as well as arbitration matters. So arbitration, and there's no preference, or both are treated as equally important as far as dispute resolution is concerned. So that is something that has to come. And I think that till that comes, India it's still a long way to go before it becomes an arbitration hub. We're happy to take questions now from anyone. Any questions? I think that's about it. Okay, thank you all. And just a word about our firm. The word Samvad means discussion, dialogue, debate, and engagement. We are a highly rated law firm with services across the country and in terms of practice areas as well. And some of our credentials are there along with this presentation. We're happy to circulate the presentation to those of you who are interested. Please do get in touch with us. Thank you.
Thank you very much, everyone, for joining in. Thank you, Arjun.
Thank you, Pras.